Hi, Deacon Ed McCormick here at St. John the Baptist Catholic Community, and this is part 3 in my series on the Holy Spirit. In part 1, we looked at the Holy Spirit and the Spirit's activity in the Old Testament, especially with those promises God made that one day God will pour out God's Spirit on Israel and on all of humanity, so that the Spirit is the renewing and restorative agent for God. And then last time we looked at the activity of the Spirit in Jesus' ministry, from his conception and birth to his baptism, his time in the synagogue in Nazareth when he announces that the Spirit of the Lord is upon him, and of course his exorcisms and healings. And all of this shows that Jesus, through the Spirit, is the one through whom God is creating a new world. God is healing and restoring all things and creating a new creation. In today's video, I want to keep going chronologically and talk about the Pentecost event. What happens after the resurrection of Jesus? So here's the sequence. Jesus is crucified, and then he's raised from the dead and begins to appear to his disciples. And according to Luke, the author of the Acts of the Apostles, 40 days after Jesus appears in many different ways to his disciples, he ascends to heaven. And I preached on this last week, and I pointed out the ascension is not divine space travel where he kind of beams out and leaves us. No, the ascension means two things. It first of all means that Jesus enters into heaven, and heaven is not some penthouse in the sky, but the heart, the center of creation, the control room where God dwells. And secondly, the ascension signifies Jesus' coronation, that he is the king of the cosmos, the king of the universe, residing in the control center. And from there, he can send the Spirit. And this takes us to Pentecost, which is the event that happens right after the ascension in the Acts of the Apostles. So the Pentecost happens in Jerusalem. The disciples are gathered there, and Pentecost is a Jewish feast. It's the feast that happens 50 days after Passover. And these ancient Jewish feasts of Passover and Pentecost were originally agricultural feasts, and Pentecost was the feast where the Jews celebrated and gave thanks to God for the first fruits of the harvest. But then these agricultural feasts got connected to important events in the life of Israel with God. And so Pentecost is it's a major Jewish feast in which they're celebrating the harvest if they're living in an agricultural area. But more importantly, they're remembering Moses going up to Mount Sinai, encountering God, and then coming down and bringing the law. So Jesus' disciples, all those early disciples were Jews. They're gathering in Jerusalem. They're there for the Feast of Pentecost. And they're gathered in particularly the same room where they were meeting with Jesus for the Last Supper. And then we are told that suddenly there's this powerful noise, and the Spirit of God comes down from heaven upon the disciples. Tongues of fire are above them, and they're able to speak in tongues, and they're able to speak in all kinds of languages. And then Peter is there, and some people say, well, maybe the reason they're speaking in these tongues is because they've been drinking new wine and they're drunk. And Peter stops and says, no, it's 9 a.m, they're not drunk. And he explains by referencing the prophet Joel, where God promised that one day God would pour God's Spirit out on all people, on men and women, young and old, and that this is that event, that this fresh outpouring of the Spirit is the hoped-for, promised event in which God's agent of new creation and restoration has begun to pour out on them, because God has raised Jesus from the dead, and he has ascended and is now in the control center that is heaven. And he's sending back to his disciples the life of heaven, the Spirit of God that creates and renews all things. So this event happened in Jerusalem. And the early church has this powerful memory that this event was like this flash flood of the Spirit, this kind of flash fire that kind of set the early church on fire. And it energized them for mission to begin to go and spread the news that God has raised Jesus from the dead and that God's new world has begun. So what's the Holy Spirit doing in this instance, in this Pentecost? Well, just as Moses went up to Mount Sinai and brought down the law, Jesus in effect has gone into heaven and has sent the new law, the promised law of the Spirit. And that Spirit gives us new hearts and new minds. It unites us to Jesus. Notice this is a communal event. This is poured out on the whole community, not just on select people, not just on Peter, but on everybody. The entire community receives the Spirit. And notice it's this experience of the Spirit that comes upon them and within them. It is, in a sense, the atmospheric condition that enables Christianity to occur. Without the Holy Spirit, there is no Christian life. There's no way for us to be connected to Jesus, who's divine and in heaven. Without the Holy Spirit, there is no mission. There are no sacraments. There's no Eucharist. That's why the priest calls down the Spirit on the bread and wine. The Holy Spirit is the agent of the Christian life, the atmospheric condition and the internal energizing presence that unites us to Christ, that starts to make us new people, so that we're filled now with the energy that raised Jesus from the dead, so that we can testify to the resurrection of Jesus by how we live and what we say and how we treat other people. In the next two videos, I'm going to take you into John's Gospel and what John says about the Holy Spirit and discipleship, and then what Paul says about the Holy Spirit and discipleship. I'll see you then.